One millionaire opened the trunk of his car and was startled to find the housekeeper hiding with two twin babies. The reason shocked him completely. Secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you are watching from. The December sun beat down on the asphalt of Maple Street when Edward Johnson parked his black Mercedes-Benz in front of the wrought-iron gates of his mansion in Beverly Hills. At 58 years old, the businessman had maintained the same routine for decades, grocery shopping. At Whole Foods on Mondays, always at the same times, always with the same meticulous efficiency that had made him one of the wealthiest men in Los Angeles. His graying temples shone under the sun as he adjusted the knot of his Italian tie before stepping out of the car. Edward was of average height, with broad shoulders shaped by years of swimming at the club, and brown eyes that rarely showed any emotion beyond calculated determination. His hands, always impeccably groomed, trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the trunk. "Another productive day," he murmured to himself, as he did every time he completed his weekly tasks. Loneliness had become his constant companion since Helen, his only daughter, left to study literature at UCLA 3 months ago. At 19, she was all he had left after the death of Mary, his wife, exactly 10 years ago. The trunk opened with a soft click, revealing neatly organized grocery bags. But something was wrong. In the right corner of the compartment, among the shadows, Edward distinguished a curled-up human form. His heart raced as he recognized the navy blue uniform. "Carmen?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Carmen Smith, 35, was crouched in the tight space, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms protectively cradling two small shapes covered by pink and blue blankets. Her usually serene and confident dark brown eyes were red from held-back tears. The oval face, framed by brown hair tied in a messy bun, was pale with fear. "Please, Mr. Edward," she whispered, her voice choked, "please don't turn me in. They are your grandchildren." Edward felt the world spin around him. The bags slipped from his hands, one tearing and spilling oranges onto the garage floor. He leaned against the car, his legs suddenly weak. "What did you say?" The words came out like a muffled roar. Carmen carefully emerged from the trunk, holding the two babies with the skill of someone who had spent months practicing those movements. The little ones, appearing to be about 3 months old, slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. "Miss Helen, she never went to Paris, Mr. Edward." Carmen took a deep breath, gathering courage. "She was here with me, in the maid's quarters. These are John and Mary, born in September." Edward looked at the rosy faces of the babies, searching for familiar features. The boy had the same curved lips as Helen when she was a baby, while the girl had the characteristic high forehead of the Johnson family. The resemblance was undeniable and devastating. "How dare you! How dare you both!" he began, but the words died in his throat. "Mr. Edward, please, let me explain." Carmen stepped forward, instinctively rocking the babies as the girl began to stir. Miss Helen was desperate. She found out about the pregnancy 2 weeks before turning 19. She was so afraid of your reaction that she begged me to help her. "Afraid? Afraid of what?" Edward roared, but kept his voice low so as not to wake the children. "I am her father. I have the right to know." "She met the father of the babies at UCLA," Carmen continued, ignoring the interruption. "A guy named Michael Smith. He studies mechanical engineering, the son of a mechanic from Silver Lake. When she told him about the pregnancy, he wanted to take responsibility, to marry her. But Miss Helen knew you would never accept it." Edward felt a toxic mix of anger and confusion coursing through his veins. Throughout his life, He had meticulously planned his daughter's future, graduating from a prestigious university, a master's degree abroad, marrying someone from his social class, a brilliant career in his company. The possibility of her getting involved with common people had never entered his calculations. You both betrayed me," he said, his voice rough with contained emotion. "For months you lied to me. You made me believe my daughter was happy in Paris, studying, fulfilling our plans." Carmen adjusted the babies in her arms, the movement revealing the exhaustion on her face. She had been Helen's rock throughout the pregnancy, accompanying her to medical appointments in secret, buying baby clothes with her own salary, transforming her small maid's room into an improbable nursery. "Mr. Edward," she said softly, "I know you are shocked and furious, but please, look at them. They are your grandchildren. They are part of you, part of Miss Helen." Edward forced himself to truly look at the babies. John opened his eyes at that moment, revealing grey-blue irises identical to those of his late wife Mary. The impact was like a punch to the stomach. "Where is Helen now?" he asked, his voice more controlled. "In London, Mr. Edward. She got a job as a nanny for a Brazilian family. She wanted to learn how to be a mother before coming back to show you she could be responsible." "A job? As a nanny?" Edward repeated, incredulous. "My daughter is working as a domestic worker." "To learn, Mr. Edward, to prove she has changed." Carmen hesitated before continuing. "She calls me every week. She is desperate to come back, but she is afraid you will never forgive her." Edward looked around the garage, noticing details he had ignored in recent months. A small children's bicycle hidden behind the spare car, diapers discreetly drying under the soft scent of talcum powder that he attributed to some new cleaning product filled the air. "How long have they been here?" he asked. "Since they were born, Mr. Edward. Miss Helen stayed with me until they were 6 weeks old. Then she left for London. She wanted so much to tell you, but she was afraid of me," Edward bitterly completed. The silence weighed heavily between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic on the street and the soft breathing of the babies. Edward looked at Carmen, really looked, for the first time in 5 years. He saw an exhausted but determined woman who had sacrificed her own privacy and security to protect her daughter and the grandchildren he didn't even know existed. "Come in," he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Let's talk inside the house." As they walked toward the side entrance that led to the staff quarters, Edward couldn't take his eyes off the sleeping babies. For a terrible yet wonderful moment, he felt his carefully constructed world crumbling, and that perhaps it wasn't necessarily a tragedy. The maids, quarters, which Edward had never visited in 5 years, revealed a parallel universe within his own home. Carmen's small room, approximately 160 square feet, had been transformed into an improvised maternal sanctuary. 2 lightwood cribs occupied half the space, surrounded by organized piles of diapers, sterilized bottles, and tiny clothes hanging on a discreet clothesline. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Edward," Carmen offered, indicating the only available chair while carefully placing the babies in their respective cribs. "I'll make some coffee. You look like you need it." Edward remained standing, observing every detail of the environment with the eyes of an investigator. On the makeshift shelf, he noticed pediatric books borrowed from the public library, mixed with handwritten notebooks containing feeding schedules and medical notes. A faded photo showed Carmen graduating with a degree in literature from UCLA, proudly holding her diploma next to an elderly woman he assumed was her mother. "You have a degree in literature?" he asked, surprised. Carmen paused mid-motion as she lit the portable stove. Her shoulders tensed slightly, as if she had been expecting this question for years. "Yes, Mr. Edward, I graduated in 2015. She kept her eyes fixed on the kettle. I worked for 2 years as a teacher at a public school in East Los Angeles before I had to accept this job. Why didn't you ever tell me? The question came out harsher than Edward intended. Carmen turned to face him, her eyes shining with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. Because you never asked, Mr. Edward. In 5 years, you never asked anything about my life beyond how I wanted my salary deposited. The truth cut Edward like a cold blade. He vaguely remembered the day Carmen started working for them, a recommendation from the domestic employment agency that his late wife used to rely on. Mary had conducted the interview while he remained locked in the office, reviewing financial reports. "Why did you leave the school?" Edward insisted, finally sitting in the offered chair. "My mother fell ill." Carmen poured boiling water over the coffee grounds, the familiar aroma filling the small space. Advanced diabetes, heart problems, the medical appointments, the medications, the tests. A teacher's salary didn't cover even half the expenses. When I learned about the vacancy here, I saw an opportunity to give her the care she deserved. Edward accepted the cup of coffee, noticing that Carmen had served the sugar in the exact amount he preferred, another detail she had silently observed all these years. "Is your mother still ill?" "She passed away last year, Mr. Edward, in March." Carmen sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she held her own cup. "That's when Miss Helen started looking for me more often. I think she noticed I was sad." Edward felt a tightening in his chest. March of last year. He vaguely remembered Carmen missing a few days of work, but he had assumed it was some minor personal health issue. He never offered condolences, never asked if she needed anything. Did Helen know about it? "Miss Helen has always been different from you." Sorry. Carmen interrupted herself, blushing. "Different from me?" Edward dryly completed. "Go on." "She always talked to me, asked about my family, my studies. When my mother died, she cried with me. It was her who insisted I take a week off for mourning, even knowing you would be upset." Edward remembered that week. Helen had insisted they could manage without Carmen for a few days, that the woman seemed to need a break. He had grumbled about the inconvenience, focused only on the disruption of his routine. The babies began to stir, making small sounds of discomfort. Carmen immediately got up, checking the diapers with practiced movements. "Miss Helen learned to change diapers here with me," she said softly, efficiently changing Mary. She would spend hours watching, asking questions. She wanted to get everything right. "Tell me about the pregnancy." Edward took a sip of the coffee, surprised by its quality. "How did you manage to hide everything?" Carmen sighed deeply before answering. "At first it was easy. Miss Helen has always been slim, so her belly took a while to show. She stopped wearing tight clothes, started wearing looser blouses. She told you she was trying a new style." Edward remembered the subtle changes in his daughter's wardrobe. At the time, he had attributed it to college influences, the new friends she was making. "And the medical appointments?" "I accompanied her. We scheduled them for the days you worked late. We used my health plan from the Domestic Workers Union." Carmen adjusted the blanket on John, who had kicked off the covers. "Miss Helen insisted on covering all the expenses from my salary. She said she didn't want me to bear the costs alone." "Did she tell you about the children's father?" Carmen's face softened slightly. "Michael Smith. She met him at the cafeteria at UCLA. He was working part-time as a waiter to pay for his studies. Miss Helen said he was the first person who treated her like a normal person, not as the daughter of businessman Edward Johnson." Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. Jealousy? Regret? "Does he know about the babies?" "He does, Mr. Edward, and he wants to take responsibility for fatherhood. He was the one who suggested that Miss Helen travel to London to gain experience and maturity before talking to you. Facing, Edward repeated, his voice louder than he intended. I am her father, not an enemy to be faced. The babies startled at the raised tone, beginning to whimper. Carmen automatically picked them up, gently rocking them while murmuring soothing words. Mr. Edward, she said calmly, with all due respect, when was the last time you and Miss Helen had a real conversation? About feelings, about dreams, about fears? Edward opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He tried to remember the last meaningful conversation he had with Helen. Meals at the mansion always followed the same pattern. He asked about grades. She responded generically. He offered unsolicited advice about career and future. She is afraid of you, Mr. Edward, Carmen continued, her voice gentle yet firm. Afraid of disappointing you. Afraid of not being good enough. Afraid of breaking the perfect image you've built for her. I just want the best for her, Edward murmured, looking at the babies who were now sleeping again in Carmen's arms. I know, Mr. Edward, but what's best for her may not be what you imagined. Silence returned to the small room. Edward watched Carmen adjust the babies in their cribs, her movements filled with maternal tenderness. A strange realization hit him. For months, he had shared his home with 3 people, his pregnant daughter and her 2 babies, without knowing of any of their existence. What happens now? He finally asked. Carmen looked him directly in the eye for the first time since the discovery in the trunk. That depends on you, Mr. Edward. I can pack my things and take the children to my home in Silver Lake, or... She hesitated. Or you can truly meet your grandchildren. And perhaps, when Miss Helen calls tomorrow morning, as she does every Sunday, you can talk to her. Edward looked at John and Mary, their breaths soft and synchronized. For the first time in 10 years, since Mary's death, he felt something beyond loneliness and control, filling the void in his chest. They stay, he finally said. But I want to know everything, every detail. Carmen nodded, a slight smile touching her tired lips. Yes, Mr. Edward, everything. Sunday dawned with a stuffy and cloudy Los Angeles, typical of the summer. Edward woke up before the alarm for the first time in years, his sleep interrupted by sounds he now identified as baby cries coming from the nursery. He put on his navy blue silk robe and descended the Italian marble stairs, his bare feet echoing in the morning silence of the mansion. In the gourmet kitchen, he found Carmen preparing bottles, her blue uniform already impeccable at 6 in the morning. She seemed not to have slept, her eyes red and swollen, betraying a night of vigil. Good morning, Mr. Edward. She didn't look up from the powdered milk she was carefully measuring. I hope the noise didn't bother you. John has colic and... Carmen, Edward interrupted, surprising himself with the kindness in his voice. Did you get any sleep? She stopped stirring, her hands trembling slightly. A little, Mr. Edward. Babies this age don't have regulated sleep yet. Edward observed the deep circles under Carmen's eyes, her posture bent with exhaustion. For a moment, he imagined Helen going through this alone in London, taking care of strangers' children while her own grew thousands of miles away. I'm going to hire a nanny, he announced abruptly. Mr. Edward, that's not necessary. It's not a suggestion, Carmen. It's a decision. Edward poured himself coffee, noticing that she had prepared the exact amount for 2 people, as if she had intuited he would come down early. You need help. Carmen finally met his gaze, tears threatening to spill. You're not going to send us away? Last night I thought a lot about this. Edward leaned against the granite countertop, choosing his words carefully. For 10 years since Mary died, this house has been a mausoleum. Silent, cold, lifeless. Last night was the first time A decade that I heard sounds of family. A sharp cry from the nursery interrupted the conversation. Carmen dropped the bottle and ran, Edward instinctively following her. In the small room, they found John red from crying, his little legs curled against his abdomen. "It's colic," Carmen explained, picking the baby up and starting to gently massage his tummy. "The pediatrician said it's normal in the first months." Edward watched, fascinated, as Carmen's experienced movements gradually calmed the child. "How did you learn this?" "Library books, the internet, and a lot of trial and error." Carmen smiled for the first time since the discovery the day before. Miss Helen was very anxious at first. She would get desperate when they cried. I had to learn quickly to help her. Can I hold him?" The question surprised even Edward himself. Carmen hesitated only a moment before carefully placing John in the awkward arms of his grandfather. Edward felt the tiny weight, the warmth of the small body, the soft scent of talcum powder and breast milk. The baby opened his blue-grey eyes, identical to Mary's, and Edward felt something break and rebuild simultaneously in his chest. "He has her eyes," he murmured, more to himself. "Miss Helen cried when she realized that," Carmen said softly. "She said that the grandmother was present in some way." Edward gently rocked instinctively, and John began to relax. "Helen was talking about Mary. Every day, especially during the pregnancy." Carmen adjusted the pillows in Mary's crib, who was still sleeping. She was afraid of not being a good mother, of not knowing how to take care of the children like Miss Mary would have known. Mary was also terrified when Helen was born, Edward admitted, surprised to be sharing these memories. She read every parenting book she could find, jotting everything down in colorful notebooks. Miss Helen did the same thing. Carmen chuckled softly. "There's a stack of notebooks filled with notes on child development in my closet." The phone rang in the kitchen, the sound echoing through the house. Edward and Carmen exchanged glances. "It's her," Carmen whispered. "Miss Helen always calls at exactly 8 on Sundays." Edward felt his heart race. "Answer normally. Don't mention that I know." Carmen rushed to answer, while Edward remained in the room, still holding John. From the hallway, he could hear fragments of the conversation. "Hello, dear. Yes, they're fine. John had a rough night, but nothing serious. How's work? I'm sure you're doing great." Edward discreetly moved closer to the door, trying to catch more details. "Helen, you need to talk to him," Carmen was saying, her voice heavy with emotion. "Your father isn't the monster you imagine. I know you're scared, but—" The voice on the other end of the line grew louder, though Edward couldn't make out the words. Carmen sighed deeply. "All right, dear. But think about what I said. The babies miss you. I miss you too. Bye." Carmen returned to the room with tears in her eyes. "She hung up when I mentioned you." Edward carefully placed John in the crib, his chest tight. "What did she say?" "That she's not ready. That she needs more time to prove herself." Carmen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She's working 16 hours a day, taking care of 3 children from a Brazilian family in London. She's exhausted, homesick, but determined to show she can be responsible." 16 hours? Edward felt anger rising in his chest. "That's exploitation. It's what she chose, Mr. Edward, to prove something to you." Edward sat heavily in the chair in the room, watching his grandchildren sleep peacefully. "I raised a daughter who is afraid of me," he murmured. "How did this happen?" Carmen sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Edward, may I ask a personal question?" He nodded, surprised by his own willingness to listen. "Have you always been like this? So controlling about everything?" Edward closed his eyes, unwanted memories surfacing. "My father was military, an army colonel, For him, discipline and control were the only ways to ensure success and safety. He opened his eyes, meeting Carmen's compassionate gaze. When Mary died, I felt that if I didn't control every aspect of Helen's life, I would lose her too. But in trying to protect her from everything, you pushed her away. Apparently. Edward laughed bitterly. The irony is that everything I did to keep her safe made her run away. Mary began to stir, small sounds of hunger escaping her lips. Carmen got up to prepare a bottle. "Mr. Edward," she said while warming the milk, "Miss Helen didn't run away out of rebellion. She ran away out of love. Love for the babies, fear of disappointing you, a desire to be worthy of the affection you showed so rarely." Edward watched Carmen feed Mary with natural and loving movements. "Do you have children, Carmen?" "No, Mr. Edward." Her voice carried a momentary sadness. "There was never time or opportunity. Taking care of my mother, working, studying, relationships always took a back seat. And now, taking care of my grandchildren?" Carmen smiled, looking at Mary, who was eagerly nursing. "Now I feel like I've found my purpose. These babies, they've taught me what unconditional love is." Edward fell silent, processing the complexity of the situation. His maid had become the maternal figure his grandchildren needed, while his own daughter was working tirelessly on another continent to prove a worth she had always possessed. "Carmen," he finally said, "I want you to teach me." "Teach you what, Mr. Edward?" "How to be a grandfather, how to care for them." Edward looked at John, who had woken up and was watching him with childlike curiosity. "How to win back my daughter." Carmen smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face completely. "It will be my pleasure, Mr. Edward, but first you need to learn something important." "What?" "How to show affection without trying to control. How to love without conditioning that love on meeting expectations." Edward nodded slowly, knowing that this would be the greatest challenge of his life. More complex than any business negotiation, more delicate than any risky investment. For the first time in decades, Edward Johnson didn't know exactly how to proceed, and strangely, it didn't terrify him as much as it should have. The first week of January turned Edward's meticulously organized routine into controlled chaos. The professional nanny he hired, Miss Eulalia, a 60-year-old woman with 40 years of experience, arrived on Monday with a suitcase full of traditional methods that immediately clashed with the modern techniques Carmen had learned from books. "A crying baby needs chamomile tea," declared Miss Eulalia, watching Carmen prepare a bottle at 5 in the morning. "These modern pediatrician fads just complicate things." "The pediatrician was very specific about the feeding," Carmen diplomatically replied, but Edward could hear the tension in her voice. "John has reflux. He needs special formula." Edward, who was observing the discussion from the kitchen door, intervened for the first time in his life regarding domestic matters. "Carmen is right, Miss Eulalia. We will follow the medical guidelines." The nanny looked at him in surprise, clearly not expecting her employer to side with the domestic worker against an experienced professional. Carmen shot him a grateful glance before continuing to prepare the bottles. Over the next few days, Edward spent more time in the service quarters than in his office. He cancelled meetings to attend pediatric appointments, learned to distinguish the different types of baby cries, and discovered that changing diapers required a motor coordination that years of tennis had not developed. "Hold her legs up," Carmen patiently instructed on Wednesday, watching Edward struggle with the adhesive tabs of Mary's diaper. "Like this. No, Mr. Edward, gentler. She won't break, but her skin is sensitive." Edward followed the instructions with the same concentration he applied to financial market analyses. "Mary made this look so natural," he murmured, finally managing to secure the diaper properly. Miss Mary had 9 months to prepare mentally, Carmen noted, wiping Edward's hands with wet wipes. And Miss Helen had a baby to practice on. You are learning with 2 children at once. Why do you always defend her? Edward asked abruptly. Mary, you haven't even met her. Carmen hesitated, adjusting Mary's outfit. Miss Helen talks a lot about her, how she laughed, how she cooked, how she sang her to sleep. She looked directly at Edward. And because I see that you still miss her very much. Edward felt a familiar tightness in his chest. 22 years of marriage. I don't know how to be a father without her guiding me. Maybe it's time to learn your own way of being a father and a grandfather. That afternoon, while the babies slept, Edward invited Carmen for coffee on the mansion's porch, a territory she had never stepped into as a worker. The view of the lush garden stretched before them, the January flowers bursting with vibrant colors under the strong sun. "Tell me about your education," Edward asked, pouring coffee from the silver coffee pot that had belonged to his grandmother. "Why literature?" Carmen held the delicate porcelain cup as if it were a fragile treasure. "I have always loved books. My mother was a seamstress, but she read to me every night. Stories by Monteiro Lobato, then Machado de Assis, José de Alencar." Her eyes sparkled with the memory. "I wanted to teach children to love words as I do, and you had to give that up to take care of your mother." "It wasn't abandonment, Mr. Edward. It was a choice." Carmen took a sip of the coffee, clearly savoring the premium quality. "Love is also sacrifice. Something I learned by watching Miss Helen during her pregnancy." "What do you mean?" "She gave up the college dreams you planned for her. She gave up her social life, the parties, the trips her friends took, all to protect these babies and find the courage to talk to you." Edward set the cup down on the saucer, with more force than necessary. "You all keep talking as if I were some kind of tyrant." "You are not a tyrant, Mr. Edward." Carmen leaned slightly forward. "But you are a man who has never learned to show love without imposing conditions." "What conditions?" "Perfect grades for approval, specific career for pride, suitable marriage for social acceptance." Carmen counted on her fingers. "Miss Helen told me she never heard you say you loved her without adding, and that's why I hope you—" Edward felt as if he had been punched. He tried to remember a moment when he had expressed pure affection, without an agenda, without future expectations attached. The memories refused to come. "My father never said he loved me," he finally admitted. "He showed approval through achievements, grades, awards, successes. I thought I was being a better father than he was, because at least I said the word love. But always conditioned to performance. Apparently." Edward looked at the garden, where Mary had planted rose bushes that still bloomed 10 years after her death. "She tried to teach me. Mary. She said I was too hard on Helen, too demanding." "What happened when she died? How did you and Miss Helen cope with the grief?" Edward closed his eyes, painful memories surfacing. "I threw myself into work. We doubled the company's revenue in the following 2 years. Helen became a silent child. She stopped talking about feelings, stopped asking for things, stopped being a child. She learned that emotions were inconvenient, and that love was something earned by being perfect." Edward opened his eyes, finding Carmen's compassionate gaze. "God above, what have I done to my daughter?" Before Carmen could respond, the sound of crying came from the nursery. They both instinctively stood up, but Edward gestured for her to stay seated. "Let me try," he said. In the makeshift nursery, he found John awake and fussy. Edward picked him up with still clumsy movements, but increasingly confident. "Hi, John," he murmured, slowly walking around the small space. "Your grandpa is here. Your grandpa who doesn't quite know what he's doing, but is learning." The baby gradually calmed down, his little fingers gripping Edward's linen shirt. To his surprise, Edward began to hum, a lullaby that Mary used to sing to Helen, buried in his memory for decades. "Boy da cara preta, pega esta criança que tem medo de careta." Carmen appeared in the doorway, watching silently. When Edward finished the song, she whispered, "Miss Helen told me that Miss Mary sang this to her." "I had forgotten I knew the words," Edward admitted, still gently rocking John. "Maybe you have forgotten many things about how to be a father without trying to control." Edward looked at the grandson in his arms, then at Carmen, who had become much more than a domestic worker in recent weeks. She had become the bridge between the man he was and the grandfather he wanted to learn to be. "Carmen," he finally said, "when Helen calls on Sunday, I would like to talk to her." "Are you sure?" "No," Edward replied honestly, "but I need to try. I need to tell her that I know about the babies, that they are safe, that—" He hesitated. "That you— Does she love unconditionally?" Edward nodded, his throat too tight for words. For 39 years, he had tried to be the father he thought Helen needed. Perhaps it was time to try to be the father she deserved. John had fallen asleep in his arms, completely trusting in the safety of that inexperienced, yet genuine embrace, and for the first time since Mary had died, Edward felt that perhaps there was still time to fix the mistakes of the past. Sunday arrived, heavy with tension and expectation. Edward woke up at 5 in the morning, after a night nearly sleepless, mentally rehearsing the words he would say to Helen. He put on a light blue polo shirt, the same color Helen always said brought out her eyes, and went down to the kitchen, where he found Carmen preparing coffee with visibly trembling hands. "Are you nervous too?" he asked, trying to sound casual as he poured 2 cups. "Very, Mr. Edward." Carmen didn't try to hide her anxiety. "Miss Helen is going to be shocked. She might hang up immediately. She could be furious with me for telling—" "Hey!" Edward gently interrupted, surprising both with his kind tone. "You did what you thought was right. I won't let her blame you for my negligence as a father." At exactly 8 o'clock, the phone rang. Carmen looked at Edward, who nodded encouragingly before answering. "Hello, dear." "Yes, everyone is fine." "Helen, there's someone here who wants to talk to you." Edward saw the panic in Carmen's eyes as she handed him the phone. Her hands trembled as he took it. "Helen?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. The silence on the other end was deafening. Edward could hear his daughter's rapid breathing, the sound of London traffic in the background. "Dad?" Helen's voice was laden with terror and disbelief. "How did you— What is—" "I know about John and Mary, dear." Edward closed his eyes, choosing each word carefully. "I know you never went to Paris to study. I know you're in London working as a nanny." "Dad, I can explain," Helen began, her voice cracking. "You don't need to explain anything, Helen." Edward felt tears threatening his eyes. "I need to apologize. I need to apologize for creating an environment where you felt you had to hide your pregnancy, hide my grandchildren from me." Another silence. Edward could hear muffled sobs. You're not angry?" The question came in a broken whisper. "I am angry, yes." Edward took a deep breath. "Angry at myself, for failing so much as a father that my own daughter preferred to face a pregnancy alone rather than trust me." "Dad?" Helen was openly crying now. "I was so scared. You always talked about my career plans, about college, about how I couldn't disappoint the family legacy." "Forget the legacy, Helen," Edward exploded, surprising Carmen, who dropped a cup. "You are my daughter. You and those children are my legacy. The rest is just money and ego." Have you met them? The babies?" Edward looked through the kitchen door, where he could see Miss Eulalia changing Mary's diaper in the living room. "John has your mother's eyes, and the same stubborn way of gripping people's fingers. Mary has that little dimple in her chin that you had when you were a baby." Helen laughed through her tears. "They're beautiful, aren't they? They're perfect." Edward leaned against the counter, feeling an emotion he had forgotten how to express. "And you are perfect too, Helen. You always have been. I just never knew how to show that without trying to mold you into what I thought you should be. Dad, I messed everything up. I got pregnant at 19 by a mechanic's son. I dropped out of college." "Helen," Edward interrupted firmly, "you created life, 2 beautiful, healthy lives. You found the courage to protect them even when you were scared. You're working 16 hours a day in another country to prove your responsibility. How is that a mess?" Carmen approached, whispering, "Ask about Michael." "Helen, tell me about the father of the children. Michael." There was hesitation before Helen answered. He is amazing, Dad. He studies mechanical engineering at UCLA, works part-time to pay for his studies. He's the most honorable man I've ever met." "Does he know about the children?" "He knows. And he wants to marry me. He wants to take responsibility for everything. But I said I needed to first." She hesitated. "First what?" "First prove that I could be a good mother. That I wasn't that spoiled girl who only knew how to spend your money and go on shopping sprees." Edward felt his heart break. "Dear, you were never spoiled. You were a child trying to please an impossible father. I didn't even know how to change a diaper, Dad. I had never held a baby in my life. How was I supposed to take care of twins? And how are you doing now?" Helen laughed through her tears. "Better. The family here has 3 kids, 2 4-year-old twins and an 8-month-old baby. I'm learning a lot." But her voice faltered. "But what? I miss my babies so much it hurts physically. I cry every night thinking about them. And I miss home. I miss you." Edward had to lean against the counter, his legs weak. "Then come home, Helen." "But I haven't proven myself yet." "Prove here. Prove by taking care of your own children in your own home with the support of your family." Edward looked at Carmen, who was silently crying. "Prove by being happy, not punishing yourself. And Michael, will you accept him?" Edward thought of the young man who had chosen his daughter not for her last name or bank account, but for who she was. "I would like to meet him. Any man who can make my daughter smile the way you smiled when you talked about him on the phone deserves a chance." "How do you know I smiled?" "Because Carmen told me. And because I recognize that tone in your voice. It's the same one your mother used when she talked about me." Helen sobbed. Can I come home?" "This has always been your home, dear. And it always will be." "And the babies? How?" Edward smiled. "Carmen has been the perfect substitute grandmother. Miss Eulalia is helping. And I'm learning to be a grandfather." "Are you taking care of them?" "I'm trying. Yesterday I managed to change a diaper without letting Mary escape from the table. Carmen considers that a historic milestone." Helen laughed, the most musical sound Edward had heard in years. "I want to come home, Dad. I really do." "Then come back. When can you get a flight?" "I need to give the family a week's notice, maybe the end of January." "I'll send the jet to pick you up." "Dad, that's too much." "Helen," Edward interrupted, "for 10 years since your mother passed away, I've spent money trying to control your life. Let me spend a little bringing you back to where you belong." There was a long silence, filled only by the emotional breaths of father and daughter. "Dad," Helen finally said. "Yes, dear. I love you. Even when I was afraid of you, I always loved you." Edward felt the tears finally overflow. I love you too, Helen, unconditionally, and I apologize for taking so long to learn how to show Idri. When they hung up the phone, Edward turned to find Carmen openly crying in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what, Mr. Edward?" "For taking care of my family when I didn't know how to do it. For teaching me that love is not control." Edward wiped his own eyes. "For giving me a second chance to be a father." Carmen nodded, unable to speak. From the living room came the sound of crying. John had woken up. "Shall we take care of your grandson?" Carmen offered. "Let's take care of our boy," Edward corrected, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel alone in his own home. The following days passed in a mix of anxious anticipation and everyday discoveries. Edward cancelled business meetings for the first time in 2 decades to accompany Carmen to a pediatric appointment at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, personally driving the Mercedes while she held the babies in the back seat. "Mr. Edward, you don't need to come with me," Carmen had protested on Tuesday morning, adjusting the babies in the car seats Edward had bought the previous Saturday. "I know you have important commitments. More important than my grandchildren." Edward adjusted the rear-view mirror to watch John and Mary. "Besides, I need to meet Dr. Henry in person. I want to understand everything about their development." In the pediatric office, Edward watched closely as each examination took place, asking questions that surprised both Carmen and the doctor. Dr. Henry Thompson, an experienced pediatrician used to dealing with wealthy families, immediately noticed the unusual dynamic between the businessman and the housekeeper. "The babies are developing perfectly," Dr. Henry explained, examining Mary. "Appropriate weight, normal reflexes. Carmen has done an exceptional job in caring for them." "And John's reflux?" Edward asked, jotting down the information in a leather notebook he had specifically bought to record his grandchildren's medical data. "Gradually improving. The special formula is working well. But I would like to know about the children's mother. When will she return to take over the supplemental breastfeeding?" Edward and Carmen exchanged glances. "Soon," Edward replied diplomatically. "She's finishing up some commitments abroad." After the appointment, Edward suggested something that completely surprised Carmen. "How about we have lunch somewhere? The babies are calm. You deserve a break." Carmen hesitated. "Mr. Edward, I can't. It wouldn't be appropriate. I'm your employee." "You are much more than that, Carmen." Edward stopped in front of a discreet Italian restaurant in Silver Lake. "You are the person who saved my family when I didn't know how to do it." In the restaurant, Edward watched Carmen order a simple salad while he chose a pasta entree. The babies were peacefully sleeping in the double strollers that had become a constant presence in their lives. "Tell me about your neighborhood," Edward asked, genuinely curious. "Have you lived in Silver Lake for a long time?" "Since I came to Los Angeles 10 years ago." Carmen chewed slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I live in a small apartment with my mother, used to, before she passed away." "What was your mother like?" Carmen's face softened. "Miss Constance was a seamstress. She worked for 40 years for wealthy families in the city. She always said she learned a lot about human nature by observing how people treated those who took care of their most intimate garments." "What did she say about that?" "That a person's true character is revealed in how they treat those they consider inferior." Carmen looked meaningfully at Edward. "She would be surprised to know I'm having lunch with my boss." Edward felt the impact of the observation. "And you? Are you surprised?" "Shocked, to be honest." Carmen smiled shyly, "but also grateful. I feel like I'm getting to know a version of you that perhaps even Miss Helen doesn't know." "Maybe because this version never had permission to exist before." At that moment, Mary began to whimper. Carmen automatically got up to attend to her, but Edward gestured for her to stay seated. "Let me try," he said, picking up the baby with growing confidence. The other restaurant patrons watched curiously as the well-dressed businessman cradled a child while a woman clearly from a different social class remained seated at the table. Edward noticed the glances and, for the first time in his life, didn't care about social judgments. "She's hungry," Carmen observed as Mary continued to fuss. "Then let's prepare the bottle," Edward signaled to the waiter. "Excuse me, could we have warm water to prepare a bottle?" The waiter, initially confused by the unusual request, quickly brought what was asked. Edward watched Carmen prepare the formula with experienced movements. "Teach me," he requested. "Mr. Edward, how to prepare the bottle, how to hold, her to feed. I want to learn everything." For the next half hour, in a discreet restaurant in Silver Lake, Carmen taught millionaire Edward Johnson the basic fundamentals of infant care. Other patrons stopped eating to observe the unusual scene, a clearly prosperous man patiently learning from a humble woman how to feed a baby. "Like this," Carmen guided his hands. "Keep her head slightly elevated. She controls the pace." Edward followed the instructions, marveling when Mary accepted the bottle and began to suck contentedly. "Incredible," he murmured. "How can something so simple seem so complicated?" "Because you're overthinking it," Carmen laughed softly. "Babies sense our anxiety. The more relaxed you are, the easier it is for them." "How did you learn to be so natural with them?" Carmen hesitated before answering. "I think it's because I never had expectations about how it should be. I just responded to what they needed in the moment." Edward reflected on this as Mary finished the bottle. "I've always had expectations about everything, about Helen, about work, about how life should follow specific plans. And now I'm learning that the best moments can't be planned." Edward looked at Mary, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "Like this moment here." When they left the restaurant, Edward made an impulsive decision. "Carmen, you mentioned that your mother was a seamstress in the area. Can we stop by her old workshop? I'd like to learn more about her story." Carmen seemed surprised, but guided Edward through the narrow streets of Silver Lake to a small sewing shop on a quiet residential street. "Miss Olivia still works here," Carmen explained, pointing to an elderly woman with white hair bent over a sewing machine through the window. "She and my mother were partners for 20 years. They entered the small but organized shop, filled with colorful fabrics and mannequins with clothes in various stages of completion." Miss Olivia looked up, recognizing Carmen immediately. "Carmen, what a joy!" The woman warmly embraced Carmen before noticing Edward and the babies. "And who are these little angels?" "Miss Olivia, this is my boss, Mr. Edward Johnson, and his grandchildren John and Mary." Miss Olivia studied Edward with experienced eyes, clearly assessing the man before her. "Pleasure to meet you." Constance always spoke of the daughter who worked for an important family. "Actually," Edward said, surprising Carmen, "I'd like to know more about Miss Constance. Carmen told me she was an exceptional seamstress." For the next hour, Miss Olivia shared stories about Carmen's mother, revealing a woman of dignity and intelligence who had raised her daughter with solid values despite financial difficulties. "Constance always said," Miss Olivia concluded, "that true elegance doesn't come from what you wear, but from how you treat the people around you." When they left the shop, Edward drove in contemplative silence. Finally, he stopped in front of the mansion and turned to Carmen. "Thank you for taking me there," he said sincerely. "I'm sorry. I never met your mother. She seems to have been an extraordinary woman." "She was, Mr. Edward, and I'm sure she would be proud to know that I'm taking care of 2 such special children." Edward looked at the babies sleeping peacefully in the back seat. "Carmen, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Have you ever thought about having your own family, children?" Carmen smiled sadly. I have, yes. But life took other turns. Caring for my mother, then working to support the household, there was never time or opportunity for serious relationships. And now, caring for John and Mary. Now, Carmen looked at the babies with maternal tenderness. I feel that perhaps fate has prepared me for this specific moment, to be here when they needed someone the most. Edward nodded, understanding for the first time that some people are placed in our lives not by chance, but by purpose. And as they carried the babies inside the house, he wondered how many more lessons about family and life Carmen still had to teach him. LAX buzzed with the typical movement of a Saturday morning when Edward parked the Mercedes in the VIP area. Beside him, Carmen held a bouquet of white roses that he had insisted on buying, while in the back seat John and Mary slept peacefully in their car seats. 26 days had passed since the phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Edward, are you sure you want me to come?" Carmen asked for the third time, nervously smoothing the navy blue dress that Edward had discreetly suggested she buy for the occasion. "Carmen, you've been taking care of my grandchildren alone for months. Helen needs to see you. She needs to know she doesn't have to choose between family and you." Edward checked his watch. "Besides, I'm going to need moral support." The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed by either of them, the millionaire businessman admitting he needed emotional support from his housekeeper. The flight from London landed promptly at 10:40 a.m. Edward felt his heart race as the first passengers began to emerge from international arrivals. Carmen held the babies, one in each arm, keeping them awake for the reunion. Then Helen appeared. Edward barely recognized his daughter. Her brown hair was shorter in a practical cut that framed a more mature face. She had lost weight, but not in a concerning way. She looked more like the healthy definition of someone who had worked physically. She wore simple jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a green top that Edward had never seen before. But it was her eyes that surprised him the most. They had a new depth, a maternal seriousness that hadn't existed before. Helen saw them and stopped abruptly, her hands visibly trembling. Her eyes went straight to the babies in Carmen's arms. "My babies," she whispered, tears already streaming down her face. Carmen approached first, extending John. "They've grown so much, dear, and they've missed you every day." Helen took her son with careful but confident movements that Edward noticed were much more assured than his own initial attempts. John studied her for a moment before smiling, instinctively recognizing his mother. "Hi, my love," Helen murmured, kissing her son's forehead. "Mommy is home." Edward approached slowly, carrying Mary. "She keeps looking at people as if she's studying faces," he commented softly. "Carmen says she's looking for you." Helen extended her free arm. Edward carefully placed Mary down. For a moment, mother and children formed a perfect tableau of family reunion. "Dad," Helen finally said, looking at Edward with tear-bright eyes, "thank you for taking care of them, for giving me this chance." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you for coming home." The hug that followed was different from any display of affection they had shared before. It carried no expectations or hidden agendas, just pure relief and love. During the drive home, Helen talked about London, the exhausting yet educational work, the nights spent crying from homesickness, the letters she wrote to the babies but never sent. "The family I worked for was very good to me," she explained, soothing John, who had started to get fussy in traffic. "But seeing other children grow up while mine were here, it was torture." "Why did you stay so long then?" Edward asked, genuinely curious rather than critical. "Because I needed to prove to myself that I could be responsible, that I could work, take care of children, be independent." Helen glanced at Carmen in the rearview mirror. "And because I was terrified that you would change your mind about accepting me back." Helen, Edward said firmly, this has always been your home. No matter what happens, it always will be. Arriving at the mansion, Helen paused at the entrance, observing the subtle changes. The garden had toys discreetly scattered among the flowers. The porch featured a new rocking chair. The service entrance had been widened with a ramp for strollers. "You changed the house," she remarked. "The house changed itself," Edward corrected, "to accommodate new life." Inside the mansion, Helen explored the rooms with the eyes of an experienced mother. In the living room, she noticed the grand piano now sharing space with a colourful playmat. The formal library had gained a section of children's books. "Dad," she said, picking a children's storybook from the shelf, "did you buy this?" Carmen suggested it. She said it's never too early to start reading to them. Helen turned to Carmen, who was discreetly organizing the baby's things. "Carmen, you've turned my dad into a grandpa." "No, dear, he has always been a grandpa. He just needed to learn how to show it." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Edward furrowed his brow. He wasn't expecting visitors. "I'll get it," Carmen offered, but Edward gestured for her to stay with Helen and the babies. At the front door, Edward found a young man of about 22, clearly nervous, holding a bouquet of supermarket flowers and a small paper bag. "Mr. Edward Johnson?" The young man had honest brown eyes and calloused hands from manual labor. "I'm Michael Smith, father of John and Mary." Edward studied the young man who had captured his daughter's heart. Michael was shorter than him, with broad shoulders from physical work, slightly long dark hair, and an open face that radiated nervous sincerity. "Michael," Edward finally said, "Helen arrived an hour ago." "I know, sir. I tracked the flight." Michael took a deep breath. "I wanted to come earlier to meet you properly, but I thought you needed time to reconnect." Edward noticed that Michael wore a clean dress shirt, but clearly not expensive, carefully pressed pants, and polished but worn shoes. The effort to make a good impression was touching and obvious. "Come in," Edward said, opening the door. In the living room, Helen looked up and her face lit up completely. "Michael!" She carefully stood up, still holding Mary, and rushed to hug him. Edward watched the reunion of the young couple, noticing how Michael immediately took John from Carmen so that Helen could hug him properly, how he kissed both babies' foreheads before kissing Helen, how his eyes filled with tears as he held the children for the first time in months. "They've grown so much," Michael murmured, his voice choked. "Michael," Helen said, turning to Edward, "this is my dad. Dad, this is Michael." Michael approached Edward, still holding John, and extended his free hand. "Mr. Johnson, I know I'm not what you imagined for Helen. I don't have money. I don't come from a well-known family, but I love your daughter and our children more than my own life, and I promise I will spend the rest of my existence striving to be worthy of them." Edward studied the firm handshake, the direct eyes, the respectful but not subservient posture. He remembered himself at 22, trying to impress Mariana's father with similar declarations. "Michael," Edward finally said, "any man who can make my daughter smile like she's smiling now already has my initial approval." The relief on Michael's face was palpable. "But," Edward continued, and everyone tensed, "I want to know your plans, for Helen, for the children, for your future." Michael looked at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "I graduate in mechanical engineering in December, sir. I already have a job offer from a multinational company. The starting salary isn't high, but it's enough to rent a suitable apartment for our family. I want to marry Helen, officially adopt the children, and build a stable life." "And your parents? How do they feel about the situation?" Michael smiled for the first time since he arrived. "My dad said any grandchild of Edward Johnson will be welcome in the Smith family. My mum is already knitting baby clothes." Edward felt a pang of respectful surprise. Michael's family had accepted the situation with more grace than he initially had. "And you, Helen?" Edward turned to his daughter. "What are your plans?" Helen exchanged glances with Michael before responding. "I want to go back to college, Dad, but I changed my major. I want to study education." "Education?" "Yes. Working with children in London showed me where my true passion lies. I want to be a teacher, specializing in early childhood education." Edward processed this information. Education was vastly different from the business degree he had planned for her, but looking at Helen holding her children, seeing the confidence, with the maternal instinct that London had developed, he realized that perhaps she had finally found her true calling. "Well," Edward said finally, surprising everyone in the room, "it seems you all thought this through carefully." Carmen, who had been silently observing the proceedings, stepped forward. "Mr. Edward, if I may suggest, why don't we start with lunch? The whole world must be starving, and the babies will need feeding soon." Edward nodded, grateful for Carmen's practical intervention. "Excellent idea. Michael, will you stay for lunch?" "If it's not an inconvenience, sir." "Nonsense. You're family now." As they moved toward the dining room, Edward realized that his carefully ordered life had been completely transformed. In a matter of weeks, he had gone from solitary widower to grandfather of twins, from controlling father to supportive parent, from employer of a domestic worker to... What exactly was Carmen to him now? Looking around at this unexpected family, Helen and Michael with babies, Carmen organizing everything with quiet efficiency, himself learning to navigate emotions he had suppressed for years, Edward felt something he hadn't experienced since Mary's death: completeness. But he also knew that real challenges lay ahead: financial arrangements, living situations, wedding plans, educational decisions, family dynamics, all requiring careful navigation. For the first time in his life, Edward looked forward to tackling problems that couldn't be solved with money or corporate strategy. These were human problems, requiring human solutions. And surrounded by people who clearly loved each other, Edward felt ready to learn this new skill set. Lunch stretched on for 3 hours, an eternity by Edward's usual standards. The mahogany dining table, which had accommodated only silent, solitary meals for years, now vibrated with animated conversations, intermittent cries of babies, and the comforting sound of a family reconnecting. Michael had proven surprisingly eloquent in describing his engineering projects, while Helen demonstrated newfound maturity in discussing her educational plans. Carmen moved naturally between serving the meal and caring for the babies, as if she had always been part of that family unit. "Michael," Edward said, carefully cutting a piece of salmon, "tell me about your family. I want to get to know my new in-laws." The young man swallowed his bite before responding. "My father, Mr. Joseph, has had an auto repair shop in Silver Lake for 25 years. My mother, Miss Mary, worked as a nursing assistant at St. Mary's Hospital until she retired last year." "And do you have siblings?" "2 younger sisters. Carla is studying medicine at UCLA, and Patricia just graduated high school this past January." Edward noticed how Michael spoke of his family with pride, without any trace of shame about his humble origins. It was an attitude he respected, even recognizing that it had taken him decades to genuinely value people for their character, rather than their bank accounts. "Helen," Edward turned to his daughter, who was discreetly breastfeeding Mary, "how do you want to proceed with university? We need to sort out your enrollment for the semester starting in March." "I've already researched, Dad. UCLA has an excellent education program, and they accept transfers. I can continue from where I left off, just changing my area of concentration." And the children. How will you balance studies with motherhood? Helen exchanged a quick glance with Carmen before responding. Well, I was hoping that if Carmen could continue helping me, at least part-time. Carmen nearly dropped the platter she was serving. Dear, are you sure? With Michael here, you'll want privacy. You'll want to start your own family. Carmen, Helen interrupted firmly, you are not just our employee. You are the person who saved my children when I couldn't. You're the grandmother they met first. I don't want to raise them without you. Edward observed the emotion on Carmen's face and made a decision. Carmen, what if we renovated the back annex? You would have your own space, but still be close to help with the children. Mr. Edward, that is very generous, but it's not generosity, Carmen. It's practical necessity. Edward leaned forward. Helen will study. Michael will work. I have the business. The babies need someone we can trust completely. Michael, who had remained silent during this discussion, finally spoke. Carmen, if I may say, Helen speaks of you as a second mother. It would be an honor to have you as part of our family. Carmen's eyes filled with tears. Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden. Burden, Helen laughed. Carmen, you taught my father to be a grandfather, kept my children safe and healthy, and gave me the courage to come home. How could that be a burden? At that moment, John began to cry in Michael's arms. The young man stood up automatically, rocking the baby with natural movements that surprised Edward. Do you have experience with babies? Edward asked. Yes, sir. I have 8 little cousins. In our family, everyone learns to take care of the children. Michael smiled, managing to calm John with ease. My mother always said that a man who doesn't know how to change a diaper isn't ready to be a father. Edward reflected on this. He himself had never changed a diaper until a few weeks ago, leaving all the childcare to Mary when Helen was a baby. Michael, Edward said impulsively, why don't you bring your parents over for dinner tomorrow? It's time for our families to meet properly. Michael's face lit up. Are you sure, sir? They will be very honored. I'm sure. Carmen, could you prepare something special for the occasion? Carmen nodded, already mentally planning the menu. What kind of food do they prefer? Home-cooked food, Miss Carmen, Michael replied. Nothing too elaborate. My mother always says that the best food is made with love, not expensive ingredients. Edward smiled. Then Carmen is the perfect person to cook. She has both ingredients. After lunch, while Helen showed Michael the baby's accommodations in Carmen's renovated quarters, Edward found himself alone with the woman who had become much more than a housekeeper. Carmen, he said, helping her organize the dishes in the kitchen, can I ask you a personal question? Of course, Mr. Edward. Are you happy with all these changes, with your life becoming so intertwined with ours? Carmen paused, rinsing the plates, considering the question carefully. You know, Mr. Edward, for a long time I thought happiness was having my own home, my own family, my career as a teacher. And now I realize that happiness can take many forms. She turned to face him. Taking care of John and Mary, seeing Helen become a mother, watching you discover how to be a grandfather, that has given me a purpose I never knew I was looking for. But don't you feel like you're sacrificing your own dreams? Carmen smiled. Maybe some dreams are different from what we imagined. Maybe my destiny was always to be here, in this moment, taking care of this family. Edward nodded, understanding. He himself had discovered that the rigid plans he made for his life had given way to something much richer and unforeseen. Carmen, there's something I want to discuss with you. Yes? I want to formalize your position in the family, not just as an employee, but as a family member, with benefits, retirement plan, premium health insurance, and I want you to be officially registered as the children's nanny." "Mr. Edward, that's too much." "No, Carmen, it's the least I can do. You deserve security and recognition for what you do for us." At that moment, Helen and Michael returned from the laundry room, Helen carrying a pile of baby clothes to wash. "Dad," Helen said, "Michael and I were talking. We want to get married before he graduates." Edward raised an eyebrow. "When exactly? May, maybe? Something simple, just family and close friends." Edward looked at Michael, who was clearly nervous about the future father-in-law's reaction. "Michael, can you adequately support my daughter and my grandchildren on your starting salary?" "Not luxuriously, sir, but adequately, yes. And I plan to continue studying, specialize, grow professionally." Edward nodded slowly. "Then I suggest we have the wedding here in the garden. Carmen, do you think we can organize a beautiful ceremony for May?" Carmen smiled. "It would be an honor to help plan Helen's wedding." Helen ran to hug her father. "Thank you for accepting all of this, for accepting Michael, for supporting our decisions." "Helen," Edward hugged her back, "I spent years trying to shape your life into my plans. Now I want to support the plans you make together." As he watched his daughter, future son-in-law, grandchildren, and Carmen organizing details of the new family setup, Edward realized he had discovered something that money could never buy: a truly united family, built on love and mutual acceptance rather than expectations and control. The afternoon stretched golden through the mansion's windows, and for the first time in 10 years, Edward Johnson felt truly at home in his own house. The evening arrived with a gentle February breeze that brought with it the scent of jasmine that Mary had planted years ago. Edward found himself on the porch, watching Helen and Michael in the garden while the babies slept peacefully in their double strollers. The young couple whispered to each other, their hands intertwined, occasionally leaning in to check if John and Mary were still asleep. Carmen appeared at his side, carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. "They make a lovely couple," she observed, offering a cup to Edward. "They're so young," Edward murmured, accepting the tea gratefully. "Sometimes I forget that Helen is only 19. "Miss Helen has grown a lot in the past few months, Mr. Edward. Motherhood has transformed her." Edward nodded, watching as his daughter carefully adjusted Mary's blanket before returning to her conversation with Michael. "Carmen, can I ask you a question that might sound strange?" "Of course." "Have you ever felt like your life was going down a completely different path than you planned, but somehow it was exactly where you were meant to be?" Carmen laughed softly. "Every day since I started. Working here, Mr. Edward." "What do you mean?" Carmen leaned against the porch railing, choosing her words carefully. "When I was a child, I dreamed of being a teacher, having my own classroom, teaching children to love books as I did." She paused, taking a sip of her tea. "I never imagined I would end up being a housekeeper. Do you regret it?" "No, Mr. Edward, because I realize now that maybe I have become exactly the kind of teacher I was meant to be. It's just that my classroom is this house, and my students are you learning to be a grandfather, Miss Helen learning to be a mother, and Michael learning to be a father." Edward felt a pang of emotion. "And me, Carmen. What have you taught me?" Carmen studied him with thoughtful eyes. "Taught? No, Mr. Edward. You already knew everything you needed to know. You just forgot how to show it." At that moment, Helen and Michael approached the porch, pushing the baby strollers. "Dad," Helen said, "Michael and I want to talk to you about something important." Edward felt a knot in his stomach. "Sure. Shall we go inside?" In the living room, while Carmen discreetly organized some of the baby's toys, Helen and Michael sat side by side on the leather sofa. Edward chose the armchair where he used to read financial newspapers, but now it was surrounded by children's storybooks. "Dad," Helen began, her hands nervously smoothing her skirt. "There's something about Michael that you need to know." Edward felt his heart race. "What?" Michael took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Johnson, my full name is Michael Smith Johnson." "Johnson," Edward repeated, confused. "Yes, sir, it's a long story, but—" Michael looked at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "My paternal grandfather was Joseph Johnson. He worked as a gardener for a very wealthy family here in Los Angeles in the 1960s. Edward felt something familiar echo in his memory. "Joseph Johnson." "Yes, sir. He told me stories about this family before he died when I was a teenager. He talked about a boy from the house who he helped create, always playing in the garden while he worked." The realization hit Edward like a bolt of lightning. "Your grandfather, he took care of my parents' garden." "That's right, Mr. Edward." Michael leaned forward. "My grandfather always said there was a boy named Edward who would spend hours talking to him about the plants, asking how the flowers grew." Edward abruptly stood up, walking to the window. Long buried memories began to surface. A kind man with calloused hands who taught him about rose bushes, patiently listening to his childhood questions while his parents were busy with social commitments. "Joseph," Edward whispered. "He had a scar on his right hand from a pruning accident." "Exactly." Michael stood up as well, excitement growing in his voice. "He always told that story. He said you were very worried at the time, insisting he go to the doctor." Edward turned, looking at Michael with new eyes. "Your grandfather was like a second father to me for a few years. My parents traveled a lot, leaving me with the nannies. Joseph was the one who really paid attention to what I said. He always said you were a special child, very intelligent, but also very lonely." Carmen, who had remained silent, stepped closer. "Mr. Edward, this explains so much." "What do you mean?" "The immediate connection you felt with Michael, the way you recognized something familiar in him." Carmen smiled. "Fate has mysterious ways of bringing families together." Helen wiped away tears that silently streamed down her face. "Do you realize what this means? Michael is not just the father of my children. He has been almost family to us for a long time." Edward sat heavily, processing the implications of this revelation. "When did Joseph die?" 5 years ago, sir. Cancer." Michael sat back down next to Helen. "But until the end, he spoke about that boy, Edward, who became a successful businessman. He always said he had planted good seeds in that child." "He planted more than he knew," Edward admitted. "Everything I know about taking care of plants, about patience, about observing growth, I learned from Joseph." "Dad," Helen said softly, "now I understand why you accepted Michael so easily. Part of you recognized him." Edward nodded slowly. "And now I understand why Michael seemed so familiar. He has the same gentle eyes as his grandfather, the same respectful way of speaking." Carmen approached with a tray of fresh coffee. "Mr. Edward, may I suggest something?" "Of course. Why don't we visit your grandfather Joseph's grave tomorrow, all together with the babies, so you can introduce your grandchildren to the man who helped shape their grandfather?" Michael smiled, tears shining in his eyes. "My grandfather would be so proud to know that his 2 families have reunited." "2 families?" Edward asked. "Yes, sir. He always said he had 2 families, the Smith family he raised, and the Mendonça family he helped shape in spirit." Edward felt a deep and complex emotion wash over him. "Michael, did your grandfather ever mention if he had any regrets?" "Just one, Mr. Edward. He said he wished he could have seen what kind of man that boy Edward would become." "Well," Edward said, looking at Helen, "with the babies, at Michael, who carried the gentle legacy of his grandfather, at Carmen, who had brought them all together, I think we can show him." That night, As the house finally fell silent with everyone asleep, Edward stayed awake in his office, looking at an old photo he had found in a box of childhood memories. The photo showed him at 7 years old, standing next to Joseph in the garden, both smiling as they watered the rose bushes. For the first time in decades, Edward understood that the circles of life sometimes close in ways that transcend planning or logic. Joseph had planted seeds of kindness in a lonely boy, and now, 40 years later, that gardener's grandson was bringing new life and purpose to that boy's family. It was as if Mary, Joseph, and even the babies themselves had conspired from beyond to teach a fragmented family how to become whole again. Edward smiled, carefully putting the photograph away. Tomorrow, he would take his grandchildren to meet the great-grandfather they never knew, but whose legacy of kindness already flowed in their veins. Forest Lawn Cemetery was quiet on Sunday morning, dotted with families visiting their loved ones. Edward drove the Mercedes through the narrow paths, following Michael's directions until they reached a simpler section where modest headstones marked lives lived with dignity, even without ostentation. Carmen had prepared a small bouquet of white roses from the mansion's garden, the same rose bushes that Joseph had planted decades ago. Helen held Mary in her arms, while Michael carried John, both babies curiously silent, as if they understood the solemnity of the moment. "It's here," Michael said softly, stopping in front of a simple grey granite headstone that read, "Joseph Smith, 1932-2019, planted gardens and cultivated hearts." Edward knelt before the grave, carefully placing the roses. "Joseph," he murmured, "I brought some people for you to meet." Michael stepped closer, holding John. "Grandpa Joseph, this is Mr. Edward Mendonça, the boy from the garden you always remembered." He paused, his voice choked. "And these are your great-grandchildren, John and Mary." Edward closed his eyes, letting the memories flow. "Joseph, you taught me that gardens need patience, that the best flowers grow slowly, with constant care." He opened his eyes, looking at the babies. "It took me 40 years to understand that you weren't just talking about plants." Helen stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her father's shoulder. "Dad, tell Grandpa Joseph about the babies." Edward smiled through the tears that began to form. "Joseph, these are my grandchildren. John has your keen eyes, always observing everything around him. Mary has your patience. She can spend hours just watching the flowers. In the garden," he paused, "and your grandson Michael, he inherited your kindness, your ability to love unconditionally." Carmen approached, placing a small jasmine seedling next to the roses. "Mr. Joseph, I'm Carmen. I took care of these little ones when they needed it most, and now I understand that perhaps I was guided by you to be in the right place at the right time." Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Grandpa, remember when you used to say that true families are not just made of blood, but of daily choices to love and care? Look at our family now." Edward observed the group gathered around the grave, his daughter transformed into a wise mother, the young man carrying the legacy of kindness from Joseph, the woman who had become the heart of the family, and the little ones who represented hope and continuity. "Joseph," Edward finally said, "you planted more than gardens. You planted lessons that crossed generations. And now your seeds have finally blossomed into a family that you helped to create." As they left the cemetery, the sun was high, and the day promised warmth. Edward suggested stopping for lunch at a simple restaurant that Michael recommended in Silver Lake, the kind of place he had never frequented before, but that now felt like part of expanding his horizons. During lunch, as he watched Michael teach Helen how to properly burp the baby, Edward made a decision. "Michael," he said, "I have a proposal for you." The young man looked up, alert. Yes, sir. I want you to come work for my company after graduation, not because you are my son-in-law, but because I need engineers with your integrity and vision. Michael nearly knocked over his glass of juice. Mr. Edward, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. It's a serious offer with a salary commensurate with your qualifications and growth prospects based on merit. Helen squeezed Michael's hand. Dad, are you sure? Absolutely. Our company needs fresh blood. People who understand that success is not just profit, but positive impact. Edward looked directly at Michael. Your grandpa taught me that true growth comes from careful cultivation. I want to apply that philosophy to business. Carmen, who had remained silent, smiled. Mr. Edward, that's wonderful, but may I suggest something more? What? Why don't we create a scholarship program in honor of Mr. Joseph for young people from working families who want to study engineering or education? Edward stopped chewing, considering the idea. Carmen, that's brilliant. We could call it the Joseph Johnson Scholarship Program, Cultivating Futures, Helen added, excited about the possibility. Michael was visibly moved. My grandpa always said that education was the only inheritance that no one could take away. He would be honored. Then it's decided, Edward declared. We'll establish the program this year. That afternoon, back at the mansion, Edward found himself alone in the garden for the first time in weeks. The rose bushes that Joseph had planted were lush, preparing for the March bloom. He knelt where he used to play as a child, where Joseph patiently answered his endless questions. Carmen appeared on the porch, watching him silently. For a few moments before approaching, Mr. Edward, may I join you? Of course, Carmen. Edward stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. I was thinking about Joseph, how he knew that patience was the secret to cultivating beautiful things. And you learned his lesson. It took me 40 years, but I think I finally understand. Edward looked at the house, where he could see Helen and Michael through the living room window, taking care of the babies. Family is not something you control or plan. It's something you cultivate day by day with love and patience. Carmen nodded. And sometimes the best families are those we choose, not just those we are born into. Carmen, Edward turned to her, there's something I need to say. Yes? You transformed our family. You brought back my daughter, taught me how to be a grandfather, showed me that love is not possession. Edward paused, choosing his words carefully. You are part of this family now, not as an employee, but as the sister I never had, the advisor I always needed. Carmen felt tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Edward, he gently corrected. Just Edward. We are family now. At that moment, the sound of laughter came from the house, Helen and Michael playing with the babies. It was a sound that the mansion hadn't heard in a decade, a sound that transformed bricks and marble into home. Edward, Carmen said, trying out the name, can I make a confession? Of course. When I started working here 5 years ago, I thought it would just be a temporary job, until I found something better, more suited to my training. She smiled. I never imagined I would find my purpose in life, caring for a family I didn't even know needed care. Edward laughed. Funny. I always thought I knew exactly how my life should be. I planned every detail, controlled every variable. And I found out that the best moments are those that could never have been planned. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in golden hues, Edward and Carmen walked back to the house. Through the illuminated windows, they could see Helen reading a storybook to the babies, Michael organizing toys, Miss Eulalia preparing the nighttime bottles. It was a scene of familial normalcy that Edward had lost 10 years ago and thought he would never regain. But there it was, renewed and expanded, including people who had arrived through unexpected paths and become essential. That night, As the house finally quieted, Edward sat in his office not to review financial reports, but to write in a journal he had decided to start, a record of the extraordinary days that had transformed his ordinary life into something extraordinary. "Joseph was right," he wrote. "The most important seeds are planted not in the soil, but in the hearts, and sometimes they take decades to bloom into gardens we could never have imagined." Out there, in the garden, in silence, the rose bushes continued their quiet growth, preparing for yet another spring of beauty. And inside the house, a patched and expanded family slept peacefully, united by threads of love that had proven stronger than all the expectations, plans, and fears that once threatened to separate them. Edward closed the journal and went upstairs to his room, where for the first time in a decade he would fall asleep in a home filled with life, love, and endless possibilities for the future.